Twitch and YouTube. Hello, welcome, and everybody, welcome on the TikTok and on Discord. It is our Thursday readings, which means very, very big trigger warning. We are talking about sexual violence, and fortunately, today is the last day that we'll be reading Rape, a South African Nightmare by Pumla Gqola. She is a local writer and a good friend of mine. Please do yourself a favor, give her a follow on all her socials and read her books because she is absolutely brilliant. And Moss is on Discord, and we have nobody commenting yet on Twitch or YouTube. You're welcome to go there. And Moss is also on the Tiki Talkie. Yes, I like the fact that there are two places at once. So, when we stopped with this book last year, we didn't finish the final chapter. We spoke about the act of claiming manhood as a state of being an adult, different from, although sometimes linked to the patriarchal denunciation of quote-unquote emasculation. Manhood is a rejection of the specific infantilization of African men in the context that Pumla is writing about. And so, while it may seem straightforward, shortly after reading this passage, I wrote a piece about colonial masculinity, and essentially colonial masculinity being tied to a sense of not even like envy of the black body or envy of black masculinity, but proving one's manhood. So even in activist spaces, you see activist actions being gendered in very precise ways, not always patriarchal, but even patriarchal ones are not always engaged in things like war talk or anything like that. But there is a sense of a celebration of violent masculinity. And it is this complicated composition of what constitutes masculine, what constitutes an inferiority complex in terms of masculinity. You are three places at once. Thank you so much, Moss. But there's this always, in every single space we find, a sense of hyper-masculine performance that is influenced by this collective goal towards what the person who is performing that masculinity wants masculinity to be in their ideal world. So we read this passage about the denial of manhood, claiming manhood, the fact that under apartheid and performance, exactly, Revenant, performance, how specific racial groups, more often than not, black men were referred to as boy to demasculinize them. The struggle to be a man means the struggle for dignity, the reclaiming of rights, and the right to be treated as a human being. And this is something that needs to be read into any analysis of war, of colonization, of any form of domination of one over the other. You always have the sense of the masculine trying to prove itself. So, we carry on. Different meanings can be attached to what is claimed to be manhood. Under apartheid, such declarations are assertions of adult agency, which is defiant in the face of an infantilizing regime, calling black men boy constantly. This is difficult to read the mere statement of manhood as automatically indexing patriarchal relationships with women. The warning here is that superficial attention to history, and therefore superficial attention to context, leads to easy answers that don't hold up to scrutiny. The warning notwithstanding, assertions of masculinity need not function on a single plane. It is possible to both profess gendered adulthood to the apartheid state and imply hierarchical relationship between those genders. And this is not just true of the African National Congress, our ruling party, which was the freedom movement, which is essentially just South Africa's Hamas. But the ANC masculinity is also... get out of here. No, I did not mean to invite you. I thought I blocked you. When the claim of manhood was also accompanied by masculinist organizational structure, or when the manhood being claimed was basically a de facto patriarchal masculinity, then of course we could read patriarchal and therefore in a negative relation to women. In addition to the critique of white supremacists and minoritization of men. This is particularly clear of the oft-repeated claim by black men in the left, drawn from various liberation movements in Africa and its diaspora, that they have been emasculated and need to assert masculinity over women, and that women should rightfully enable this return to masculinity. Because apparently, like, women needed to bend over because white people were treating them in this way. I don't know. Like, make it make sense, please, because I don't understand how it makes sense. But this is true of all colonized men in some way, shape, or form. When the colonizer has this kind of chokehold over masculinity, when it has this chokehold over capitalism, when the colonizer controls everything, that essentially shows the black and brown man that he has no power, ultimately. The one place in which he can assert power is against his own quote unquote woman. So the black man who is disenfranchised, the brown man who is disenfranchised in the workplace and in society by whiteness, by white supremacy and capitalism, will come home and assert his patriarchy. While this emasculation discourse challenges the infantilization that black men suffer in racist white regimes, the claim to recover from emasculation often requires the performance of hypermasculinity that women are expected to support as part of enabling those men to attain manhood. Thank you. And yes, it is a hypermasculinity, because as soon as they step out of those places where other men, mind you, it's not women emasculating disenfranchised men. It is other men disenfranchising them and emasculating them in the capitalist and the white supremacist sense. Women bear the brunt of enabling that hypermasculinity, that overcompensation. In some of its most brutal manifestation, it directly trivializes sexual violence by these men. In the essays collected in Frank Talk 10, Andile Ngamita and Ati Georgia, argue that black men cannot inflict violence on black women because the former attains the status of woman under white supremacy and can therefore not access, let alone exert, patriarchal power, And because black life is so generally violent that when black men rape black women, this cannot lead to any kinds of trauma that sexual violence produces. I don't know how they came to these conclusions. Like, neither of them are psychologists. And Ati Georgia is not really somebody that I want to listen to, let alone Andile Tama. That's how you say it. Andile Tama. Sorry. So basically, what they're saying is that because it is an assertion of gendered power that has been taken away from them or granted to them by the white man, the women, therefore, cannot experience the trauma related to it. These men need to go to therapy. Men will do anything except go to therapy. Exactly. So, in other words, they, like colonial legislators, argue that black women are impossible to rape. They do so in a collection of writings that ostensibly offers critique of white violence on black bodies. And I've read some of their work. It's ew. Their war talk is most evident in the contempt demonstrated by these two writers towards black feminist activism and writing, and most especially black lesbian feminist work. Nkitama and Georgia do so while also rhetorically going to great lengths to position themselves within radical black tradition. I have dealt with patriarchal inversion before in an earlier chapter of this book. The widespread reading of left-wing masculinities as exclusively or predominantly assertions of political agency, codified as heroism, enables this spectacular masculinity that I criticize in this chapter. But the left does not have monopoly over hypermasculinity. Both militaristic, gun-toting culture of Afrikaner masculinity that was revealed to be embodied in figures like Oscar Pistorius, as well as the triple threat of laddism, raunch culture, and retrosexism of white English-speaking public masculinities, are also stages of hypermasculinity. Dominic Rizzo's work explores this, especially in the article Lad Magazines, Raunch Culture and the Pornification of South African Media. In her longer research project, Raunch Culture and the Increasingly Pornification of South African Media, she shows the manner in which ostensibly benign and ironic masculine positions of feminism, or laddism, actually code misogynistic cultures. In other words, war talk, in such media not marked as pornographic, the idea of women's objectification and men's dominance is esteemed. Although laddism and raunch culture do not immediately appear violent, they are in fact staging of hypermasculinity. In the midst of songs about machine guns and guns fired through locked doors, it's important to remember that hypermasculinity also claims patriarchal manhood through these patriarchal sexual cultures. Oh, I'm glad you're cozy. Rizzo shows, in such a case of raunch culture, this violence is both pornographic and normalizes pornography. When she writes of porn, she refers specifically to the violent sexual representation and framing of sexuality, not to unhindered sexual expression. They are different. This is also the sense in which I spoke of Empire as a pornographic project, in the same manner as Dabyedin in an earlier chapter. Violent masculinities reveal themselves in contrast with forms of masculinity. Here, self-authorizing performance of patriarchal masculinity unfolds in public spaces, specifically, where such performances hint at masculine violence or a contrast between forms of manhood. I am not like those men. When Zuma sang the hugely popular struggle toy song Umshini Wam, meaning my machine gun, when he was charged with rape, he understood the power of heroic masculinity, having previously embodied it himself, and knew how to reference it to shame his victim, Kwezi. Many feminist commentators point out in public forums, including the press, at the time, that Zuma's behavior and choice of Toy Toy songs were inappropriate because they located him at the realm of heroic and militant masculinity, and the complainant, by implication, was placed in opposition to the struggle. His performances folded Zuma's spectacular masculinism to the realm of heroic, an idiom recognizable to most South African audiences. Mshini wam, aweletu mshini wam, bring me my machine gun, was a struggle song. Like, it was used as like, this is the armed struggle and this is what we are doing to fight the apartheid regime. But him using it outside a rape trial, that has very different implications. When a struggle song that has such, well, she says it here. Wait. I skipped some things. Right. While some commentators fixated on the symbolic phallic presence of a machine gun to stand in for a penis in this instance, it's important to note that even if he sung a different struggle song, the performance of hypermasculinity would still have been possible. This is because the struggle was a fight against an oppressive regime. When a struggle song that has such resonance is sung in the context of a now powerful man accused of rape, it takes on symbolic value to cast the complainant as the enemy. More importantly, it casts her as the enemy to all of those who are able to sing the song. In other words, Kwezi becomes the enemy and safe to treat in any way because she is an enemy that has been marked with associations that come from apartheid. All righteous, freedom-loving people are reminded of the wounds of apartheid, incited to anger, ready because the apartheid memory is so fresh in all of us. So that Kwezi becomes possible to burn. It's therefore not a huge leap from seeing her as a political enemy like like an Askari might have been to chanting "Burn the bitch." In his essay, Jacob Zuma and the Family, which was first published in the Sunday Times on 6 March 2003, Njabula Ndebele declared that he was intrigued, pained, and revolted by Zuma's self-representation. In calling for his machine gun as he faced a rape trial, Zuma showed how he had mastered the art of spectacle, and he really had. Along with the immediate associations that the song would have evoked where military associations with the armed struggle are evoked, the anger was underlined as the appropriate response to apartheid, as well as the importance of taking up arms as self-defense against and an attack on a brutal white supremacist regime. The song would have reminded even those only marginally involved in the struggle or the marches that brought South African cities to a halt during the transition to democracy, being from both the recent and distant past. The song invited the public to view Zuma's prosecution as unjust. And indeed, it acquainted Kwezi in the rape trial with an oppressive past. How many of you in leftist spaces have come across men who are, I know many of you have, but just for argument's sake, I want to see hands in the chat. Men in these struggles who are there to get laid. I prefer not to come across men. So many men are involved in these leftist, feminist, anti-racist spaces, specifically white men involved in these spaces because they are there to objectify black and brown women and are there to get laid. While the women are doing the work, while the femmes are doing the work, the men are there to get laid. I have come across way too many of them. Oh, absolutely. 100% prefer getting pussy to being a good person. It is absolutely self serving. 100% self serving. And when they realize that they've been caught out, they go back to being fucking right wing incels. They go back into their holes and say things like Nick Fuentes was right. Andrew Tate was right. I was trying not to say it. Or they go into other spaces and do the same thing because those people don't know them in those spaces. Like, oh, you don't know. So I'm just gonna go and try the same thing. And I specifically see it in feminist spaces. People saying, oh yeah, all men are trash. All men are this. It's like it is all men until it's no men. It makes sense that women choose to bear, yada, yada, yada. And then when it comes to choices where they can actually be the bear or be the man in the forest, they will always choose to be the man. And this is what I see in a lot of leftist spaces now, especially white men. White men who say, yeah, I'm embarrassed to be white, you know, those kinds of things. Like, they say all the right things, and all they want is ass. I have known way too many. The bear doesn't pick man bear either. Yep. Do you know that dragonflies sometimes play dead? So that, female dragonflies play dead so that the male dragonflies would leave them alone. W dragonflies. The biggest W goes to praying mantids who rip off the heads of their male partners, copulate, and then leave their dying bodies. Yay. Well done, praying mantids. Yep. Absolutely W to the praying mantids. I'm scared of them, like arm's length. I love them. They are fascinating creatures. I always thought, from the time I was a kid, I thought that praying mantids would judge my lack of faith. And so I used to keep a distance from them. That is amazing to know, bee. Speaking of bee, there's a certain breed of bee. As soon as they have done their mating duties, they all die. And I'm just like, you know, I kind of like the one who's downstairs. They don't even do the honey. So, honey nut Cheerio, but that is a good joke. Honey nut Cheerio. That's a W. But aside from that being really shitty behavior, it gets dangerous. Yes, they do. They do look judgmental. This is so, so dangerous because these struggle songs resonate. These men who say all the right things, it's like, yes, this resonates. This triggers a specific response in my psyche, in my body, and the safety that comes with being able to trust somebody you can walk home with from a protest. Someone who can, okay, this person, it just proves that no men are safe. It is absolute psychological warfare. Oof. I'll explain it to you. I'll explain my reality to you one day as somebody with DID. But walk home with and hear somebody, I think it was between 10 and 15 years ago, on posting on Reddit that, thank you, I was supposed to take her home, but he drugged her and he raped her, filmed it and put it on Reddit. They were literally at a women's rights protest together. When a man who is charged with rape sings songs like Awiletu Mshiniwam, convincingly, he asserts that the struggle isn't over. Another facet that resonates with many black South Africans who face unemployment, a largely untransformed economic system, and ongoing racism. Zuma's Toi Toi was an obvious echo of a time when the spectacular reigned supreme, according to Ndebele. They kept the larger issues of society in our minds. Ndebele's own response to Zuma's spectacle was twofold. He asked that Zuma think about the damage of his chosen performance of masculine bravado and the claimed internal ANC conspiracy. He wrote, Zuma must now call off his supporters. His ability to do so will expose him to yet another test. What are the limits of his capacity for self-mastery? The latter attribute is vital for whoever aspires to high office. It will enable him to spare me and others among the public the pain and revulsion I feel when I see him on television, calling for Mshini Wami. He was knowingly and defyingly inviting me to make horrible connections between the AK-47 and his invasive penis. I know. The public moral issues are as graphic as this. That is why he sang and danced with his supporters. Images of South Africa's raped mothers, sisters, daughters, infants, nieces, aunts, grandmothers raced through my mind. Are their pain and the broad sense of public morality of so little consequence in the settling of quote-unquote family scores? Thank you. I appreciate that. I've been reading for 5 years on this app, and I'm not gonna stop. I may have taken breaks every now and then, but I'm still gonna continue. Yay, I'm glad. Nice. Brilliant book. When Zuma appropriates Mshini Wime for personal use, He reminds his onlookers that he is a struggle veteran and whoever opposes him is the enemy. Later, his supporters outside the courtroom and elsewhere would label all those who were critical of Zuma as dogs and counter-revolutionaries. When young communist leader and ANC Youth League spokesperson Zizi Kodwa was quoted widely in the South African press as saying that Zuma supporters would punish dogs and send them back to their handlers, many of Zuma's detractors, among them Ndebele's name was associated with such dogs. Kodwa made no secret that dogs included those who publicly criticized Zuma's utterances during the trial, inside and outside the courtroom. Two particular pronouncements by Zuma earned him the wrath of feminist commentators. He insisted that he had taken a shower to avoid HIV after sex with an HIV-positive complainant. Secondly, declared that a visibly aroused woman had to be sexually satisfied lest she lay false rape charges. This language and iconography borrow from the old struggle grammar of the spectacle and pretend that the lines between the issue at stake are clearly drawn. In the 1980s, apartheid prime ministers, soldiers, informers, police officers were routinely called dogs by the anti-apartheid struggle. So arguably, when Kodwa referred to Zuma's critics as dogs, he invited associations with unjust attacks. In his statement and other utterances by Zuma allies, the vice president of the ANC and later president of the same organization became the archetypal wronged struggle hero. In a series of moves ranging from his own self-positioning and claiming of a popular song as his own, to Kodwa's utterances and later pronouncements that all who critiqued them in any way became sellouts. Such critics then became responsible for all of Zuma's difficulties and were in cahoots with the complainant, Kwezi, and those who had conspired against Zuma from within the ruling party. The HIV shower, yep. In such instances, it was clear that causality is a matter of making simple connections in order to produce the most startling and shocking results. When Zuma took up this metaphorical machine gun, he was implying that Kwezi, the complainant in the rape case, and all those who believed her and or questioned his own behavior were agents of the apartheid state. He did not need to say this explicitly, as his colleagues later did in response to COPE, another party formed in 2008 by former ANC leaders, Ndebele and others. Zuma just needed to invoke apartheid and thereby index the ready anger in many black South Africans' minds and hearts at any echo of it. And Ndebele would have it that his definition of spectacle calls for emotion rather than conviction and establishes a vast sense of presence without offering intimate knowledge. When we look at the very public life of, say, Oscar Pistorius, we can see a different form of hypermasculinity and a violent one on the rise. It is the intersection of embodied masculinities celebrated in athletics, all forms of racing, rugby. Riva Steenkamp occupied center stage as her boyfriend and killer, Oscar Pistorius, stood trial to prove his case that he didn't kill her in a moment of rage, but actually mistook her for an intruder, whom he presumably intended to kill. That his high-profile case defense essentially relied on the assumed appropriateness of pumping bullets into an intruder, code for young black criminal. This is a glimpse into how war talk works. Therefore, even if Steenkamp was not the intended target, such excessive violence was not in itself a problem, according to their defense. There are legitimate and illegitimate targets for such violence, and Paralympians' girlfriends are simply not legitimate targets, it would seem. Of course, the evidence calls into question this very premise on which defense in Pistorius' trial hinged, emerged, and spoke quite eloquently in Melinda Ferguson and Patricia Taylor's book called An Accident Waiting to Happen, reverberating well into the court of public opinion. This court matters not only in cases where violent men are defended, as Mama Kize, the woman who was Zuma's most visibilized supporter outside court, and the Pistorians, but also a much more sophisticated unmasking of violent masculinities and war talk than is even possible in our country's criminal justice system, which reveals it to be consistently hostile to women survivors and victims of hypermasculinity. Rather than being a sudden occurrence, the masculinist spectacle makes sense alongside other cultures of gendering politics in South Africa, and may explain. I lost my place. And may explain why it is inhabited by men who otherwise embodied and embraced heroic militant masculinities within the liberation movement and in sports. The machine gun may be seen as the precursor to Julius Malema and Zwelinzime Vavi's declarations that they would kill for Zuma. It also anticipates the pronouncement of Jason Makwane, a regional ANC Youth League leader, that any opposition party formed by former ANC members should be exterminated like cockroaches, a position he held even though his attention has been drawn to the similarities it bears with sentiments that enabled the Rwandan genocide. Thank you. Mkwane's responses, quoted in Mataboge's article, are worth reproducing here, alongside statements by other leaders within the alliance. I'm not feeling bad about the statement. All the people in COPE are behaving like cockroaches and should be destroyed. They are behaving like cockroaches, and cockroaches should be killed. We're not talking about killing human beings here. When you see a cockroach in your house, what do? You kill it. I want you to understand how we are going to kill them. We mobilize our forces, our masses, and ensure that the ANC wins. Elsewhere, Malema is quoted by Letsoalo and Rousseau as saying, "We call on the ANC Youth League structures to be on high alert. Counter-revolutionary forces are moving to destroy the revolution. They will find us ready, not to speak to them, but to dismiss them. Defenders of the revolution are on alert to defend it. Now, we say come 2009, Zuma will be president. Only death can stop us from ensuring that this happens." On his part, Beki and Chali told Tabane and Rousseau that we cannot have judicial systems that act in a manner which the courts have acted. No amount of threats will intimidate Cosatu from talking about the conduct of the judiciary. We are not going to be told that the judges are angels. They take decisions under an influence. And Gwede Mantashe, was quoted in Letsoalo saying, "He is the president of the ANC. You hit the head, you kill the snake. When there's an attack on him, it's a concerted attack on the head of the ANC." These are not quotations from activists engaged in real war. They're statements from men in power to silence dissent. Hypermasculinities do not only feature in war talk through military and extermination metaphors of snakes and cockroaches. They also emerge in the brazen admission by men in the South African media, who seem perpetually fascinated by Kenny Kunene, a wealthy businessman with a criminal past and a penchant for public declaration of his own misogyny. When asked by Pearl Tusi on Metro FM, a show that she co-hosts with Fat Joe, whether he had sex with his students in his past life, in his past as a teacher, Kunene reportedly admitted to doing so with students younger than 16, the legal age of consent. He was unfazed when Tusi declared that he admitted to statutory rape, but Kunene went much further than this, tweeting variously that he was gang raped by women and enjoyed it. There are so many problems with Kunene's use of rape here in both instances. Problems that Jenny Thorpe has illustrated well and at length in Consent is Key, KK, including first his emphasis on collecting women as objects of desire, clearly indicating that his masculinity is founded on problematic ideas of sexuality where men consume women, and where male virality and sexual prowess at the expense of women's pleasure and at the expense of women's health is at the center. Aye. Second, violence against women remains a joke to most South African men, and that there is little understanding of the connection of the social messages that sanction this violence. Example, invite men to use their penises as a weapon or to the violence itself. Threatening someone with gang rape incites violence. Acting as if this is no big deal promotes myths that rape is not a serious crime. Third, describing his own consensual sex fest as rape further illustrates ignorance and diminishes the experience of rape survivors. And finally, Kene Kunene has admitted to being a statutory rapist and has threatened violence against other young women. Claims should be investigated by the SAPS, the South African Police Service. The objectification and interchangeability or disposability of women and the light-hearted description of consensual group sex as rape are layers through which Kunene trivializes and mocks rape performed by himself. Routinely, by his own admission and other rapists. Kunene shows and knows that there will be no consequences for such utterances, and he will continue to be celebrated as a fascinating man who has wild relationships. In public moments such as these, where rape is repeatedly mentioned as sex, fun, and as a joke, and when this can be done with no consequence, the hypocrisy of South African society, including the criminal justice system, is laid bare. Listeners to the national radio station and readers of various newspapers reported this conversation along with Kunene's own Twitter timeline, which was also screenshotted and reposted, responding further retreat into the joke when several women and men challenged his war talk, bravado, and alerted him to the consequences of his own statements and tweets. Kunene does understand that something that the rest of our society often pretends it does not know. South Africa has a greater problem with the existence of the woman who speaks of having been raped. The young man with the broken body, the old woman maimed, the child who needs reconstructive surgery. More this than it does with the existence of a known proud rapist. It is only the survivor and victim that trouble people by pointing to their own pain in South African culture. Yep, he did. The rapist is welcome to live and boast and be celebrated for hypermasculinity, even as he continues to flourish financially. In this regard, Kimberly Yates notes that the spectacular masculinity here, like any system of domination, dogmatically and inhumanely requires the extermination of views contrary to their own via severe punishment. When I responded to him, I was banned from Twitter for almost a month. Thus, the complainant is accused of rape, and the rape survivor is mocked on a radio interview, newspaper, and social media in a country where at the same time we don't understand why the statistics are so high, and why survivors are choosing not to turn to the criminal justice system that issues no consequence to public, recorded, and witnessed admissions. The language used, collective memory evoked, bravado, and masculinities referenced are those of defiance, resistance, and ultimately triumph for Zuma, and other adversity for Pistorius and Kunene. The effects of masculinist spectacle in contemporary South Africa are violent. What needs emphasis and support then is, as Ndebele reminds us, that the sobering power of contemplation, close analysis, and mature acceptance of failure, weakness, and limitations needs to be examined. Yet, even in this contest, we know they will continue to be misrecognized and even if they will be misrecognized as masculine weakness or unmanliness, positioning against violent masculinity and war talk matters. It's important to continue to assert non-violent agency, responsibility, and possibilities. There lies the invitation to broader public gender talk, as well as broadening our understanding of ourselves beyond limiting and violent performances. In his 1996 essay on Brenda Fassie, Ndebele highlighted the importance of politics of culture in creating national identity, and argues that Brenda Fassie perfected a complex network of communicating systems, insisting that her music, given the political context of a different struggle, helped to consolidate a view of culture as a site of social affirmation. It contributed to a consolidation of a sense of South African musical space, familiar to millions across the land. Some symbol changed in the process. Stadiums associated with bogus independence became sites for social assertiveness, heavily suggested in Brenda's style. In one of the most powerful novels that seeks to make sense of rape history, Ntutuzeli Nyoka's beautiful I Speak to the Silent stages this notion that part of what is required to undermine and undo rape culture and the violent masculinity spectrum is, as Mark Neal writes, to perform publicly witnessed instances where men break ranks with patriarchy, where individual men challenge the conventions of patriarchy, particularly when doing so in the name of black and brown women, and such men also have to consciously police men's own patriarchal privilege. In this novel, refusal to be complicit is at the heart of masculinities that are open to transformation, away from war talk, to finding answers that heal and end rape culture. Yeah, naughty bot. It is also important in Nyoka's vision that heroism be unmasked to reveal the mythologized violence at its core, an antidote to current pervasive masculine economies of representation, where the goal is to veil and hide oppression and agents. Hide them behind this veil of, but I'm fighting for our country. But I'm fighting the good fight. Are you really going to put an activist behind bars? I have chosen not to represent and repeat Kunene's rape jokes in this chapter because I do not want to know how to repeat. I don't know how to repeat a rape joke. I realize that it would make the reading easier, but rape isn't easy. So I trust my readers to search for him themselves if they need to see them. I understand that she does not want to give them air. Unfortunately, we will not be finishing the book this week. Because we have a conclusion to get through. Actually, let me see. How long is the... That's long. Let's discuss. Because I can get through it today. Because I do have the time and the energy. It's just... So, what do you get from her description of this war talk and the way in which masculinity is represented violently in these spaces? Thank you. Because I feel like theatrical cape to doff responsibility. Absolutely. So I wrote something a long, long time ago, and I needed to remove myself from being the subject here so I could look at it in a sense of what would I say to myself if what happened to me was happening to somebody else. So I wrote here, Revolutionary movements seem romantic. Poets have written about fighting against injustice throughout history. Martyrs of freedom have their tombs encrusted in pride and glory. People flock to see the tiny cell in which the likes of Nelson Mandela were jailed for acts of terrorism against the state, and protests are remembered with public holidays and state ceremonies. Echoes of the past blaring over speakers as leaders address the people, whose lives didn't change much since liberation. But the monster that lies beneath revolution doesn't howl. It growls beneath the skin of those who abuse the movement for their own gain. I'm not talking about money or recognition, but for sinister acts that nobody speaks of. Puff adders hiding in plain sight. Rape was a reality for so many women and girls in the anti-apartheid movement. The struggle against apartheid, a male-dominated power system that sought to topple the apartheid government, was, much like its adversary, coupled with the culture steeped in aggression and domination. Boys being given guns and told to fight in a war of which they had little understanding, just hatred slithering under their skin, and that hatred, when not in the killing fields, had no place to go, was eventually directed at women and girls. Under the apartheid system, only the rape of white women was prosecuted or even considered a crime, so there was a quiet and complacent acceptance that the rape of women of color was just a part of life. Black women would be turned away from police stations at townships, and the township or party leadership, ashamed to admit to any forms of abuse, would hang the humiliation around her neck. And it did hang around the necks of women who would carry on their daily lives as if nothing had happened, because there was a bigger role to play. Churches would inevitably side with the perpetrator. The community would shun the woman entirely if she continued to speak of it. Coming out with the truth was an exercise in futility. Political activists, with their sanctimonious attitudes towards saving the country from their oppressors, walked with an air of superiority amongst people they were supposedly freeing. They couldn't be bad people. They were moral and virtuous and political. So when someone said that they had been abused by an activist, it was as if they had said they supported the entire apartheid system. People knew him in her community. He was part of each protest and at all the local events. He would be at every meeting. He was one of the young ones who would do all the heavy lifting. He didn't lurk. He was open, smiling, caring, good to everyone, always willing to help, made himself almost indispensable, constantly lending a hand wherever he could, was at every dinner and gathering and took care of the kids whenever needed. He would let them climb all over him and play games like he was one of the kids. He was loved and appreciated. It came as a surprise to everyone when she eventually spoke up and said he had abused her for years. The responses were, "There's no physical evidence. Where were your parents? It's your word against his. But he's an activist. You probably have an overactive imagination. You're probably remembering wrong. He was in the struggle. You're mistaken. You're an attention seeker. I know him, and he's not like that. Why didn't you just speak up? Ugh, just move on already." And more often than not, just called a liar. And just like every other voice from the struggle who ever dared speak against its toxic men, she was silenced. Yeah. South African police and soldiers under the apartheid regime were instructed to go home and rape their wives and even daughters to encourage aggression. So we get to the conclusion. Yep, it is a weapon. Writing this book has been remarkable. I have felt compelled to write it mainly because the bulk of invitations to give lectures on it over the past decades, specifically on gender-based violence and rape more broadly, since without exception these invitations came from other feminist individuals and groups, I started thinking that maybe all the material had to be collated and shaped into a book. I also imagined that this would be the easiest book I could ever write, yet many times I've told everybody in my life I know I don't want to write it. I wish that I did not have to think about rape and that it wasn't so close to home, and I didn't have to think about how many times I felt the difficult combination of rage and tenderness as I sat across from someone as they talked about their experiences. At the same time, it occupies such a prominent place in many areas of the research I'm concerned with. I am certain to return to writing about rape in literary criticism. I wish it was possible to listen when a person speaks without feeling the rising sense of dread and nausea that someone would say something utterly vile in response. As if the trauma is not enough, everyday people in my country and in this world use the fact of having survived rape to trivialize a survivor's value as a person, all the while pretending that they are just trying to understand. So the pain they inflict is out of place due to oversensitivity, or in a cruel reversal, the accusation that the tale of rape silences those who have never experienced it, but continue to be complicit in a culture that enables it. I look forward to being able to talk about rape without shaming rape survivors. Pain is a valid source of knowledge. Pain is a valid source of knowledge. Whether it be the pain of first-hand experience or empathetic pain. But empathy is not what most people feel when faced with a story of rape told firsthand. Disbelief, questions, interrogation, demands for evidence, and for behavior to make the listener or reader feel better are the standard response. Every woman and vulnerable man notices this done to those around them constantly. It's a mystery and testament to the human spirit that survivors speak about it at all, outside of the spaces designed for healing. The increase in the reporting of rape was much more likely than the result of perceptions that the charges would be taken seriously as a result of increased occurrences. In other words, post-94, more and more women and other sexual minorities reported being raped to the police because of a changing country, breaking the silence campaigns, and a changing legal dispensation gave them confidence. Post-apartheid legislation has repeatedly been hailed for pioneering pro-feminist stances. A significant part of the optimism came with the release of Nelson Roy Hlahla Mandela in February 1990. 11th of February, my birthday. And the 27th April 1994 general election was a shift in how we all thought about our lives as South Africans. The importance of telling our stories, whatever that may be, was central to nation building. Efforts to crystallize Things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also finding echo in anti-rape and domestic abuse campaigns that reiterated the importance of breaking silence as a key to accessing freedom. This invitation to come to voice is not exclusively South African. It has long been part of a feminist consciousness where personal narratives of patriarchal wounding are shared in safe spaces. The sharing of personal narrative of patriarchal wounding is part of peeling away the layers of patriarchal violence. However, while we all wish for more open and equitable sharing of narratives of human life, of what it means to have lived through apartheid and what it means to have been human and to be human in South Africa after the fall of the apartheid regime, the truth is that these stories were not unmediated by other ideas of who matters, circulating in South Africa on both sides of the 27th of April 1994 boundary. Not all stories matter in the same kind of way. Not all are allowed to see the light of day, immediately believed and valued. For while speaking about trauma, difficulty, and the previously silenced can offer enormous relief from a burden of being that was too long carried, empathy is not an automatic response, especially for Black and brown women. And even when it exists, it competes with other responses. The survivor has to weigh up the impact of possible responses. Under these conditions, not everything is utterable. Many things remain unsayable. I have never told anybody else but one person what happened to me, what was done to me. Only one person in this world knows the extent of everything. When Beth Goldblatt and Sheila Menkes first wrote and circulated and submitted their input into the TRC on the absence of women's testimonies, this is what they were alerting us to. As they noted, although many women appeared in front of the TRC, stories of women's lives under apartheid and of women's anti-apartheid activism were muted. Even as known women activists testified, they displaced their own experiences. Goldblatt and Menkes showed how, in the words of Barbara Boswell, nationalist discourse built the new South Africa upon the injustices visited upon the bodies of women. It was possible to talk about apartheid and its demise as though activism was made only through the energies of men, and it was. In this respect, we were hardly exceptional. Scholarship on nationalisms is unanimous in how masculinist nation-building narratives are. Goldblatt and Menkes forced us to ask questions about how we might resist this process, why women were not speaking about their own activism, and why their comrades were similarly silent. Pointing to interviews in the archive of published activist women's autobiographies as a counter-narrative, we had to ask, along with them, why some experiences remained unspeakable, even on a platform designed specifically to narrate what had been silenced. We had to ask why sexual violence was equally silenced and expunged from men's testimonies when, again, there was evidence of how rape and sexual torture of activist men was part of the apartheid state manners of working. Although rape by agents of the apartheid state in liberation movements remains muted, information about its presence and why it was unspeakable started to bubble to the surface. 1 out of 9,000 people who spoke at the TRC, only one, Rita Mazibuko, spoke of rape inside the liberation movement. The response to her testimony spoke volumes about why she was the only one, even though the report stated many activist women confirmed rape in liberation movement sites. They never reported it. Responses to Mazibuko, as well as responses a decade later to other women who accused a powerful hero of the struggle of rape, were clearly instructive. It's in this context that Ntabiseng Motseme insists that we need to read silences not as absence, but as spaces rich with meaning. Silence. In asking why these silences exist, why they are forged and forced and chosen, by whom and when, lies a wealth of knowledge. Part of the apartheid archive is our failure to make any significant inroads into the scourge of violence against women. One of the ways we deal with this is through the recourse of breaking silence, where until recently we understood this to mean that women should speak about their violation in order to turn the tide. But in Nyoka's novel, I Speak to the Silent, the author retains this unarticulated knowledge as a haunting that cannot be resolved through denial, and as a haunting that threatens to render everything about a new situation, a new nation, a lie. Through the title and how silence is particularly broken in the novel, Nyoka asks questions about complicity and the silent. The silent proliferate. They are Zodwa Mbete, who witnesses rape and keeps quiet out of loyalty to her husband, and the official narrative of her movement, to other comrades who do the same in the literary realm and beyond. Those who reject silence of complicity, even in the absence of real testimony at the TRC, like author Nyoka, who nonetheless forced consciousness on their readers, imagining fiction in place of those unclaimed and unrecognized, expanding that project that Zoe Wickham inaugurated in David's story, where she suggests the use of rape as one of the ways of making women cadres more compliant, enforcing discipline. To borrow from Helen Strauss's incisive analysis, guided by the silence narrative, Bondile's call to the silent can also be read as heeding the call of the silenced, who on South African gender stages feature primarily as women whose voices of trauma are muted by the constructions that safeguard ruling masculinities. For these projects, silence is fertile territory that can explain the contradictions of a new order and demonstrate continuity in how power works. Of course, this is fiction, but the point here is that meaning created in fiction seep out into worlds beyond the fictional. Given the fact that many survivors would not come out directly to speak about their violations, even though some would feed into larger investigations, as long as specific individuals were not identified, we have some idea of the tapestry of sexual violence under apartheid across political divides. This knowledge, even if it emerges as hints rather than clearly formulated narratives, need to be woven into the narrative of South Africa's past, present, and what we are still becoming. We cannot allow these silences to stand for absence and say that this never happened. This is where fiction helps, fleshing out the hints, suggestions, confirmed instances that are never told fully as stories. Motseme reminds us the mute always speak. They speak when we allow recognition and imagination of what else happened in the past that can coexist. We do not readily speak of rape. We know it forms an important part of our past. And this past further informs how we think about the present and our future as a country. This is not just true of spaces that were explicitly concerned with defending or dismantling apartheid. It was true of our everyday lives, before, during, and after. I don't remember how old I was when I first became aware of rape as a thing, as a possibility, as something that happened to others, with far-reaching effects. I knew it in primary school as the ways in which it was both fearful and not taken seriously. A confusing injustice. Only girl students talked about how a certain girl expelled for falling pregnant had been impregnated by a teacher. We could not understand why she had to suffer, or why we were then subjected to lessons about morality and staying away from boys.
Did you miss it?
Not yet. Sorry, I have to message someone. I said I'll call when you get home, but then we didn't. Sorry, I need to message someone. He is already back in the room. He just pointed to the calendar. Why we were then subjected to lessons about our morality and staying away from boys when we could not imagine how a girl could get away from a teacher. Teachers are powerful. I don't know how we knew for a fact about this girl or several others who all left school. I just remember how certain girls and I talked obsessively amongst ourselves about what these girls had revealed. They would talk to somebody who would not keep the story to herself. Sharing it with another girl created a sense of everybody little knowing. We must have discussed it with boys because many years later, some of my men's school friends would share this memory. I remember the terror of those who felt sure that they were the next target of a teacher's inappropriate touching, cornering, and making excuses to be in class alone. As an adult, I know this is a form of grooming and is very common among pedophiles and other sexual predators. We did not know the word rape, and we understood this man's behavior as unfair and wrong and shameful, only because it was about sex in the end, and sex is shameful. We thought of this frightening sequence linked to sex, which we also thought of as revolting. Today, as an adult woman, I'm devastated at the thought of the girls who never went back to school after their pregnancy, some of whom were beaten at home because they would not reveal who the boy that had impregnated them. I remember how shamed they were for being pregnant, teenage mothers, slut-shamed. I wonder what it was that ensured that none of us told a parent or any of these women teachers that we loved or obsessed over, or the gentle man who taught us Afrikaans, who made us feel safe, who almost never caned anybody at a time when caning was taken for granted. We were tickled by this fear of caning as we understood it. We chose him over any of the other teachers. In retrospect, I think he just hated hitting children, avoided it, and when he could not do so, made sure it hurt as little as possible. We didn't tell our science teacher, who was prone to bouts of strictness, but also had the best sense of humor, who made us love science in a school that had no lab. Why not the principal, my father's friend? He had thick log the length of a ruler to threaten us with, and I know firsthand that when he brought it down on your palm 3 times, it felt more like a hand clapping than punishment, but we still feigned fear. It doesn't matter how loved or taken care of by adults we felt. I knew of no one who told an adult at school or home. We could not understand how the adults either didn't know or failed to do anything about it. Children sometimes imagine that adults are superhuman with psychic powers and eyes everywhere. It's fascinating to me that while we didn't understand all the adults needed to be told in order to protect us from one of their own, we had already learned too clearly. Shame. The lesson about shame. Even at primary school, where we did not know how to say rape, grooming, pedophile, or statutory rape, we understood shame as something that was never too far away. Ferial Hafaji wrote that she and her women friends would walk home from school aware of their bodies, fearful of what might happen to them. Hafaji links that fear and knowledge in their bodies to open attack. This fear was hers and her teenage woman friends, and their constant shadow in public spaces, but also in the block where they lived. This is why she feels so protective of a schoolgirl who tells her of sexual harassment by a taxi driver on the way back home from school. She tries to make sense of the continuities between her experiences and the schoolgirl in the taxi and Anian Boyson. This vulnerability is not new. What these columns reveal are the ways in which girls and young women feel under siege. It's not a post-apartheid phenomenon. It makes sense for us to think of continuities rather than new phenomena. This is an additional connection to the ways in which we secure our safety as an adult woman today. Imagining continuity. I was a student at the University of Cape Town in the 90s, in the confusingly violent and hopeful days when apartheid was dying. I remember sitting on a residence interview committee constituted for some reprieve for the applicant, the details of which I no longer remember. I was the House Government representative. At Tugwell House in those days, House Government meant the collective body for various student bodies in the residence, so it included student sub-wardens, corridor reps, head student receptionists, housing committees, and so forth. Because the proceedings were to determine whether to let the applicant stay on in residence or waive some fee, we were privy to some confidential information to assist us in making a decision. In several instances, the mitigating factor included cases of sexual assault. I remember the absolute fear on the face of a woman I was well acquainted with through various overlapping networks, who appeared in front of us. Upon realizing that I was part of the proceedings, she was not asked about rape, but she spent considerable time explaining that she needed consideration for other factors and that she attempted to de-link from being raped. Absolutely, Say. It was clear to me then, as it is now, that she feared that I might betray her confidence to her then partner, who was one of my closest friends. She knew that her boyfriend was growing increasingly frustrated with her changed behavior, distance, emotional unavailability, and refusal to reveal what was wrong. He knew she was withholding something. She knew that he and I confided in each other, and therefore felt unsafe with me knowing both that she had been raped and she had tried to kill herself shortly after. It took many years of awkward conversation between us for her to realize I would not tell him. While I knew I could not, I wondered for a long time what kind of difference his knowledge would have made. Would he have understood and figured out how to better support her, or would it have further complicated their relationship? As I lay rape crisis counselor, I would be privy to a range of responses from loved ones who wanted to do the right thing, and it worked differently from person to person. The most important thing is, it was her story to tell. And writing about it now, with all identifying features expunged from the writings, is the first time I've spoken about it outside of that committee. I have often thought of the story when faced with similar experiences in the past 20 years, sometimes when students and colleagues real abusive behavior, we may be able to interrupt if the survivor did not request that we hear the story in confidence. There can be real quandaries in identifying what the ethical responsibility is to the teller. So even as we continue to work against sexual violence and insist on distancing ourselves from complicities, we are keenly aware of the difficulties associated. Many people outside universities like to pretend themselves that they imagine these spaces unaffected by the power dynamics that plague the rest of our society. Hi. Yet, as events that occasionally explode to the public domain reveal, this is far from true. Whether we are speaking of sexual harassment by staff members, caught or protected, the rape culture that students are starting to write about in blogs that identify the writers as well as anonymous ones, An example of the woman who chose the pseudonym Lulu Diba earlier in this book is particularly heartbreaking. Feminists have argued that violence is one of the constitutive elements of South African society, an intimate core that grounds both historic and contemporary identity formation and contestation. Explanations for the scourge of violence in South Africa need to be contextualized against this backdrop of normalized and ingrained vast histories of violence, as well as feminist understandings that misogynist, heteronormative violences are manifestations that reflect and perpetuate the patriarchal natures of South African society. South Africa is a country deep in denial about the causes of various phenomena such as gender-based violence. It's integral to the success of fighting this violence under different circumstances that we keep an eye on the myriad ways in which experiences and justifications are used to excuse and or justify gender-based violence. As I put down the last words in this book, I realize how much of the process this has actually illuminated for me. One of the most frustrating things in my thinking and work on rape over the past 2 decades have been in my ability to really understand how women who were themselves once raped do not feel empathy for those who speak about it. I knew it had something to do with the way in which patriarchy says women do not matter, that they were not fully human, that it wasn't really rape. In the language of blackness, patriarchy inculcates self-hatred in women, like all violent oppressive systems do. I understood why survivors warn others against pressing charges. What continued to bother me was some survivors taunt and otherwise subject other survivors to secondary victimization, because that is what they've gone through. We need to rethink how we moved away from the current situation into where we are now, where too little perpetrators are held accountable. Although we have rendered gender-based violence abnormal in public talk, at a legal level, as successive feminists in the world, we have managed to do this without minimizing it. It's still commonplace. And violent men can just say that they disapprove and distance themselves at the same time is going back to acting in violent ways. It's imperative to create the kinds of realities that give survivors healthier choices, looking at the ways in which our tools have not only stopped working, but the ways in which co-option enables them to work in anti-feminist ways. I no longer think a small minority of men are holding us hostage. It's a painful realization and way to live. I think we need to rebuild a mass-based feminist movement, a clearer sense of who our allies in this fight really are, a return to women fem spaces as we develop new strategies and ways to break against and speak again our own names, to push back against the backlash that threatens to swallow us all whole. We need to defend the terrain we are losing, because it seems to me the backlash is working to keep more and more of us, if not compliant, then afraid. A future free of rape and violence is one we deserved, and therefore one we must create. I love this woman. And we are done. If we have any questions from Twitch and YouTube, please let me know. You can DM me in my let me start again. You can DM me at Discord, but I'm going to be taking a break from the screen here. So I shall see you on Tuesday for the continued reading of Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. So I shall see y'all on Tuesday, Twitch and YouTube. Eat something, drink water, take your meds, be kind. Bye.